Welcome back to Part 75 of Decode Healthcare with Harshal. Today, we are officially entering one of the absolute most high-stakes, auditor-scrutinized areas of medical coding. I'm talking about Chapter 9, the circulatory system. If you want to prevent claim denials and make sure your reporting is absolutely precise, you are definitely in the right place. Let's jump right into this explainer and master these official CMS guidelines together.
Here's our agenda for today's explainer. We're going to cover coding the circulatory system, HTN presumed causality laws, CAD angina combination traps, heart failure specificity stacking, and then we'll wrap up Chapter 9.
All right, Section 1, Coding the Circulatory System. Look, Chapter 9 covers diseases of the heart and blood vessels, and let me tell you, auditors relentlessly look for errors here. There is literally no room for guesswork. Success in this chapter means you have to master very specific terminology. Things like precise sequencing, mandatory combination codes, and presumed causalities. We aren't just assigning numbers here. We're painting a legally binding clinical picture of how systemic diseases interact.
Moving right along to Section 2, HTN presumed causality laws.
So this is where we unpack Section IC9A of the guidelines. In our world, the word with holds immense legal power. When the alphabetic index links hypertension with heart or kidney disease using with, it creates an automatic presumed causality. That means you do not need the provider to actually write out due to in their notes. The classification itself is doing the heavy lifting for you. CMS makes this incredibly clear. They state, the classification presumes a causal relationship between hypertension and heart involvement and between hypertension and kidney involvement. It's automatic. The only time you'd ever break this link is if the provider explicitly writes out in the chart that the two conditions are unrelated. If they don't explicitly separate them, you are combining them.
Let's think about how this plays out in practice. Say you have hypertension with chronic kidney disease, stages 1 through 4. That automatically merges into the combination code I12.9. But if it escalates to stage 5 or end-stage renal disease, it bumps up to I12.0. Now, you aren't done there. You still have to stack the appropriate N18 secondary code to identify the exact stage of that kidney disease. So it's two codes to tell one complete clinical story. To really lock this causality law in your brain, memorize these three main buckets. Hypertension plus heart disease goes into the I11 series. Hypertension plus CKD is the I12 series. But what if the patient has all three? Hypertension, heart disease, and CKD all together? Well, that triggers the I13 series. That's the ultimate combination code, capturing the whole shebang under one single umbrella.
Section 3, CAD angina combination traps.
Coronary artery disease coding is a massive minefield for claim denials if you're not paying attention. So I want to pose this crucial question to you. When exactly do we code angina separately from coronary artery disease? Think about that for a second. Because standalone angina codes, like I20.9, are huge, glaring targets for auditors.
The answer? Never. Literally never code angina separately if it's due to atherosclerosis. Just like with hypertension, CMS automatically assumes a causal relationship here. CAD and angina have to be merged into a built-in combination code. If you ever see a standalone angina code on a claim next to a CAD code, mentally put a giant red strike through right across it. You have to use the unified I25 category combination code. Honestly, it really all comes down to the plumbing. Are we dealing with native vessels or bypass grafts? If the CAD with angina is in a native vessel, the original vessel the patient was born with, you're living in the I25.11 series. An example would be I25.110. But if the patient has had a prior bypass and the disease is actually in the graft, you immediately shift gears over to the I25.7 series. Your documentation absolutely must support the vessel type if you want to survive an audit.
Okay, Section 4, Heart Failure Specificity Stacking.
Category I50 requires absolute precision. When a provider documents heart failure, we have to know the specific type. Is it systolic heart failure or HFrEF? That'll be your I50.2 series. Diastolic or HFpEF? That's the I50.3 series. Combined, I50.4. And then at the very bottom, we have I50.9, which is the unspecified default. As coding professionals, we run far away from I59 whenever the clinical documentation allows. Always push for specificity.
Now, how do we sequence this when hypertension gets involved? Well, CMS gives us a mandatory stacking rule.
Slot 1 must be your hypertensive heart disease combination code, so that's I11.0 or I13.0. This tells the story that the hypertension actually caused the failure. Then, slot 2 has to be the specific I50 code we just talked about, like I50.22. The I11 or I13 always leads, and the I50 always follows. No exceptions.
Actually, scratch that. There is one vital exception to this rule. What if the provider explicitly documents in the chart that the heart failure is completely unrelated to the hypertension? Well, if they break that linkage in their clinical notes, you have to follow their lead. You drop the combination codes entirely, and you sequence the hypertension and the heart failure separately based on whatever the primary reason was for that specific encounter. Remember, documentation always drives the code.
And finally, Section 5, wrapping up Chapter 9.
So, today, we successfully decoded presumed causalities, we exposed those tricky CAD combination traps, and we completely mastered heart failure stacking. It's all about translating a complex clinical reality into flawless data. But listen, Chapter 9 isn't quite done with us yet. Think about this timeline, which dictates one of the most technical guidelines in the entire manual. Day 1 is an initial acute MI. Day 14 shows a subsequent AMI. And day 28 marks the end of a very strict acute 4-week window.
Which leads me to ask you this. Are you ready to decode the rules for Type 1 versus Type 2 MIs? What happens to your claim if you miscalculate that 28-day window for I21 versus I22? Well, that is exactly what we are going to be covering in Part 76. Make sure you like and subscribe so you don't miss out on that deep dive. Keep your coding precise, stick to the guidelines, and I will see you in the next explainer.